In this part of the lecture, we'll be looking at the psychology of waiting and understanding how customers perceive their waiting time and learning about some tricks that we can use to help customers to have a more pleasant waiting experience. So when I used to walk around the classrooms and teach, I would often notice that there were some students who were looking extremely bored. So even though I'm very interesting and tell great jokes, these students looked bored and basically were trying to wait for the lesson to end. And some of them were even watching the NBA, playing esports or computer games like League of Legends and so on, or watching a movie, some of these really distracted students. But I get it. The fact is that when we are waiting for something that is boring or is unpleasant, we're just waiting, we try to do other things to make the waiting more pleasant. And in fact, there are 8 factors that you should consider that affects how customers perceive their waiting time. And there's an article that you can read for more details, but basically I have similar content with my own spin on how I explained it and on the examples. Right, the first factor is that when your wait time is occupied, that means you have something to do, it feels shorter than if your waiting time is unoccupied. And the example I'm using here is the in-flight entertainment you will have when you are flying. So typically planes will have a screen and different movies that they show you to keep you occupied and not so bored and unhappy. And also, especially the meals and the snacks are also a nice break from the long tedium of flying on a long flight. The second factor is that when you're waiting, an in-process wait after the service has started feels shorter than a pre-process wait. When you're waiting to, for example, get on board an airplane, that feels more unsettling than when you're already in and you're safely at your seats and you feel like, okay, you've already, gotten started. So there's more anxiety and uncertainty here, and here you're a bit more settled. And similar principles apply when you're waiting to get into a restaurant versus service inside a restaurant, or you're waiting to see a doctor versus in the waiting room versus you've gotten into your special room to wait for the doctor to see you. So that's more pleasant because you've started the service experience, whereas you're waiting for it to begin. So for factors 3 and 4, I'm going to use the example of flight delays. So let's say you are flying back home to Hong Kong, but your flight is it's delayed, not cancelled. So when there's a flight delay, you feel very anxious. What's interesting is that if you don't know how long you are going to have to wait, this wait will feel very unnerving and it feel longer than if the airline told you, okay, the flight is delayed because of something wrong with the plane, and in a few hours, let's say in 3 hours, we expect that everything will be good to go and you'll be able to fly back home. So if they tell you how long you have to wait, you feel better about it. And if they also explain why you have to wait, let's say there's some issues with the engine earlier, which they had to fix before they could let the plane fly to the airport, then you also feel better because there's a reason and a valid reason for the wait versus you don't know why you're waiting. So if you don't know why you're waiting, that feels terrible, but if you know why you're waiting, that doesn't feel as bad. So the next factor is customers are willing to wait longer times for services that they perceive as more valuable. Here we have a picture of a famous band called DNA, and this band, they're 7 handsome Korean guys who are very popular and have lots of fangirls and fanboys and fan men and fan women. I think they're called the Army or something. Anyhow, their legions of fans are willing to wait for hours and hours to see them at the airports or to see them at their concerts. By the way, I'm just kidding. I know that the name of the band is BTS, not DNA. So don't worry, I'm not that nerdy and out of touch. I'm actually super cool and hip. Okay, but the main point is that their fans are willing to wait for hours to see them at the airport or to see them in concert. These same fans, who might be students when waiting to meet their lecturer or teacher, might not be willing to wait more than 5 minutes to ask their lecturer or teacher a question because they don't perceive that the service they receive from this lecturer or teacher is that valuable. So factors 6 and 7. Factor 6 is that an unfair wait feels longer than a fair wait. So in this picture, we've got a screenshot from a movie called Knocked Up. And in this screenshot, what you see is that there's a line of people waiting to get into a nightclub. And there's a bouncer who basically decides to let some of the more pretty ladies get in immediately without having to wait in line. And that's something that's quite typical for nightclubs or bars. So you can imagine how the people who are forced to wait in line, who are not so attractive or not so rich perhaps, feel when other people get to cut in line, get to go in immediately without having to wait in line. So when other people can cut in line, that doesn't feel fair and the wait feels more agonizing. In this case, people are waiting in a group, so that feels better than if you had to wait all by yourself in a room separately. You don't see and you don't know that other people are also waiting with you. So there's some sense of community, or at least sense of suffering together if everyone has to wait together and everyone has to wait fairly. Finally, the last factor is that you can break a long wait into several shorter waits, and that feels more pleasant. So for example, if you had to wait 20 minutes at a restaurant for the main course that you ordered, but in between that 20 minutes, a waiter checks in with you once, maybe a few minutes later the waiter comes and apologizes, and later, in a few minutes, the waiter comes and gives you a free appetizer. So all of these interruptions make you feel that you didn't wait a long time with nothing happening, but you only had to wait a few short times. Of course, the free appetizer doesn't hurt either. Let's look at the case study of how Disneyland handles customer wait times. So all of you know, whether or not you've actually been to Disneyland or other amusement parks, that at an amusement park, there's a lot of waiting, especially for the rides that people want to go on. Okay, so how does Disneyland make the customer waiting time more pleasant? Here are some of their tricks. So when you want to ride a popular ride such as Hyperspace Mountain, you don't actually see the entire waiting area at once. The waiting line is split across multiple smaller waiting areas. And at each waiting area, you get to see some interesting things, like you can see an X-Wing, or you can see some cool videos or props when you're waiting to get onto Hyperspace Mountain. If there are a lot of people in an area trying to get onto very popular rides, Disney can dynamically schedule or ask their meet and greet characters to go to those areas so that the people there, especially the families and the kids, will be kind of distracted and perhaps might stop waiting and instead focus on taking photos and interacting with these characters. So this is Mr. Fredrickson, this is Russell, and this is Doug. I like the dog because he's very cute, even though he's a little bit silly or dumb. But anyway, I guess he's a dog, that's okay. So the fourth thing that Disneyland does is they keep customers informed about the estimated waiting time. So you might see signs like this when you go to Disneyland. So for example, the bottom half of the sign says a standby wait time is 85 minutes, which means if you get into the line now and you wait there physically for 85, you'll have to wait for about 85 minutes before you can get onto the ride. So you know how long you need to wait, and that helps you to decide if you really want to get into the line, and probably not, I guess. Next, the last thing that I want to mention is Disney's use of FastPass, which is their virtual queuing system. So how does FastPass work? For certain rides, in this case, the name of this ride is called Radiator Springs Racers. So most of the most popular rides have FastPass, and so the first thing to notice is each FastPass has a date and a time at which you got the FastPass, and the FastPass basically allows you to return during a 1 hour time window for a very short queue or waiting line if you use this FastPass to get onto the ride. However, you can only get onto the FastPass queue after a certain waiting time, which is generally the virtual waiting time is quite long. In this case, it's 4 hours and 10 minutes of virtual waiting time. The physical waiting time, if you actually stood there in line, might be 60 minutes or 90 minutes. Usually it's much shorter. There's also a cooldown before you can pull another FastPass. So in this case, once you get the FastPass, you can only get another FastPass after 2 hours. So this is the same information that I said in the previous slide, but in words, and you can read it if you like. So if we take a look at how FastPass works from the Disneyland operator's point of view, Disneyland first needs to understand or measure their ride's service capacity. For example, let's say Hyperspace Mountain has a service capacity of 600 guests per operating hours, and this is a number I just made up to make things easy to calculate. So the next thing Disneyland needs to do is to set aside some proportion of the service capacity for FastPass guests. So for example, if they decide to set aside 40%, that would be 240 customers or guests per hour. FastPasses are issued for basically 1 hour time slots with 5-minute increments. So for example, it might issue 20 tickets between 9 and 10, 20 tickets between 9:05 and 10:05, and so on. So let's think for a second. If the number of guests arriving is actually the same, how does FastPass actually help? Okay, so first, FastPass basically schedules the guests in advance, and it gives them a 1 hour time slot to return. So FastPass matches the supply, the service capacity, to the customer arrivals by using scheduling. And FastPass also helps because it reduces the variability in the arrivals. So by scheduling the 1 hour slots with 5-minute increments, you roughly get 20 guests arriving from 9 o'clock to 9:05, roughly 20 from 9:05 to 9:10, and so on. Another thing I want to mention is that the way the FastPass tickets are issued is first you issue for the first 1 hour slot. When you've issued 20 tickets, you can issue to the next slot from 9:05 to 10:05 and so on. So keep on issuing the slots and as you run out. So in the previous example, probably a lot of the time slots for this ride a lot of the FastPass time slots have already been claimed, so that the next available one that this person got was already 12:40, even though that's 4 hours into the future. Alright, so FastPass has actually been an extremely successful crowd management system at Disneyland. And let's think a little bit about these questions. So why has FastPass been successful? Okay, so first, why is it called a virtual waiting system? Why is FastPass beneficial for customers? Why is FastPass beneficial for Disneyland? So I'd love to hear what you think. So let's think for a little bit and discuss. Dum 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 da 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 dum 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 da dum 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 dum. Okay, discuss, blah blah blah. Alright, to conclude this part of the lecture, we discussed how customers perceive waiting, the psychology of waiting, and we also explained 8 factors that affect how customers perceive waiting time. And we looked at a Disneyland case study which shows some of the things that they do to some of the tricks they utilize based on the psychology of waiting to help or trick customers into having a more enjoyable waiting experience. And we also discussed the FastPass, which was an innovative virtual queuing system. And some restaurants also use a similar kind of virtual queuing system, and I believe there'll be more and more contexts or businesses which try to use virtual queuing because it enables a more pleasant waiting experience for customers. Alright, that's all. See you next time.